Hi, I'm Maddie. Let's see, history. If you couldn't tell by the accent, I'm not actually Australian. I moved here 3 years ago from the US, but I'm here for good now. And I've absolutely fallen in love with Australia. So that's why for my game, Call of the Golden Valley, I think it had to be set in Australia because I've really fallen in love with the place and sort of the unique aspects it um, has. So my background is I was a corporate software engineer, working on just large enterprise things, and then wanted to do something more creative. So here I am developing my first game, and it's a first-person female protagonist mystery game set in regional Victoria. People are disappearing into the forest, and it is your job to figure out why.
Cool.
So
That sounds
cool.
awesome. Yeah, wonderful. And Alan, if you'd like to give an introduction to yourself as well.
Sure. Hi, my name's Alan Robinson. I'm also not Australian, but I've lived here the majority of my adult life, so close to 8 years now. Um, and yeah, I'm currently working at Ghost Pattern for Wayward Strand as part of their QA team, and before that, I was working at my former old studio, Umbrella Party, working on a game called Miska, which was about the national parks here in Victoria. Um, but yeah, I'm really interested in kind of people's stories and how people connect with Australia. And so a lot of the stuff that I work on, I really like um, showcasing myself and my own stories in games, and I resonate with a lot of other people who do the same. Um, but yeah, that's me.
Very cool. Well, yeah, I guess then finally myself. So my name's Tyson Butler Boshma. I am Australian. I was born in Tasmania, that little triangle that gets left out on the world maps all the time. So I was born down there. And yeah, grew up in kind of like rural bushland my entire life. So I've got a very like deep passion for like Australian wildlife and animals and stuff like that. Um, and yeah, so I've been a game developer for a while. I'm currently a co-founder and creative director at Toybox Game Studios, and we're working on a game called Primordial's Legends Hollow Hero, which is about a cool little combat wombat named Brunt, and kind of her adventures through a fantasy, a beautiful fantasy world, and stuff like that. So yeah, cool. I guess we can move into kind of just general discussions now that like introductions are done and stuff like that. But I think actually an interesting thing that I've already sort of picked up just from looking at both of your games and thinking about my own, and then obviously the introductions that we've just done as well, talking about the fact that both of you weren't born in Australia, and yet you're both working on like highly Australian games and very interested in like sort of the culture and the people and the stories that are found in that. Whereas, interestingly enough, while my own team's game focuses around a wombat, it's actually separates itself from Australia a little bit. So I think it'd be interesting to maybe start the discussion with what, like, you're in Australia now, both of you. What is it sort of specifically that, like, really drove you to, want to make something that was like an Australian game, for lack of a better term? Something that, like, really, you found a lot of passion in and you wanted to tell this story and make these products and stuff like that.
Yeah,
We'll start with you, Matt, if you like, yeah.
it's really interesting. I think
Mm,
I've had lots of conversations with my friends who were born here, especially if they've been testing my game, and they're like, they'll have a little chuckle and I'll say, "Oh yeah, I had to include that. It's so Australian." And then they'll look at me and say,
mm.
"Is it?" Because for them,
Yeah, okay.
it's just life, I guess. And I think growing up elsewhere, I can really see what's maybe unique or unusual to Australia that doesn't occur elsewhere in sort of a like I'm an insider but outsider perspective. And so that's been really interesting. And I just was sort of you know, even well before I had the idea for the game, I was just sort of collecting these little things that happened, or, you know, mannerisms that people had or something, and they were just always sort of kicking around in my head. And then I think it got to the point where they needed to become a full-fledged story.
That's cool.
Yeah,
What about you, Alan?
Very awesome.
I actually resonate a lot with what you've just said. I don't think I mentioned where I'm from, but I'm half English and I'm also half Thai.
Okay.
But I was born and raised in Indonesia, so it's like a whole complicated mess.
Yeah, wow. Yeah.
But I think for me, and why I really resonate with Australia, is because coming from an international background like I did, I never really felt a sense of home personally. So when I moved here and I started getting to know people and getting to know the industry, I kind of really fell in love and turned this into my own home. And so I like creating content that kind of like shares my experience and what my perspective of Australia is. And that's also kind of why I like working on projects like Wayward, which are stories of people who are in Australia that aren't necessarily from Australia themselves. And yeah, I think it just kind of, like you said, Maddie, I think there's just like a unique perspective that you have, which people who are from and born and raised in Australia might, like you said, everything is just kind of normal to them. But then from our perspectives, it's like, whoa, this is kind of crazy or like wonderful in its own way. So I think we get to highlight it from a different perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah.
going off what you said, Alan, I think it really is like a deep love for Australia. Like you see it and you're like, either this is so great or like this is so weird, and you're just like, I just have to share this with the rest of the world.
100%.
Yeah, that's very cool. It's interesting, right? Because it's like, you know, talking about like the weirdness, or perhaps not that, but like the uniqueness that Australia brings in so many ways in like our culture and just the way we're perceived on an international level and stuff like that. I think for me personally as a creative director, like, and for the rest of my team, like we're all Australian born. And we have families that that immigrated here and stuff like that. But in general, we've all grown up in the culture. And one of the things we realized when working on Hollow Hero was we really wanted to make a game that had the potential to showcase parts of Australia, but was designed to be more mainstream in the way that it was seen in a serious way. I guess in an odd way of looking at it, you think about something like The Witcher, which is like obviously it takes Polish like folklore and stuff like that, and it was this thing that blew up and became this massive international thing. And for us, when we kind of looked at the way that Australia is perceived in, I guess, large media, it's always this very particular kind of accent or this very particular kind of character that is kind of clownish in a way. And I think as like indie developers in general, the games that I see, especially examples like what you're working on, do really, really, really well at like showcasing the quality of like really well told Australian stories and products that don't have to be they don't have to be 100% a joke, or like this is Australia and they're kind of known for having like kind of weird things. And I think we've tried to adopt the same idea here with our character, who's like a wombat. And yes, she's a wombat and she's inspired by like, as an Australian character, she's inspired that way, but we've put her into a world which is designed to seem a little bit more serious. Because of that feeling that like on the main stage, at least amongst our team and stuff like that, that there's this kind of disconnect between how cool and compelling a character like that can be, and that character doesn't need to be relegated to a side character that's kind of just there for like, Crocodile Dundee style jokes and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it's really like fascinating seeing like the different paths that like it's through all three of us. It's a mutual love and respect for kind of the idea of what Australia is, but the different paths that it takes to get to there. It's super, super fascinating. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking of Crocodile Dundee the entire time you were talking.
Well, that's it, right? Yeah.
And then for like women my age, there was a Mary Kate and Ashley movie that was filmed on location in Sydney, Australia, where they like go
okay.
and meet the blonde surfer boys. And I think they were
Yeah.
there because of the witness protection program.
Right.
I think
And
I
like the
remember
whole thing's
this.
just so absurd, and there's just so many more stories to be
Yeah,
told.
that's exactly right. And I think that's the kind of the I saw recently a post from a good friend of mine on Twitter who was basically saying that like once again it sucks to see that like the Australian character in a game has basically been relegated to the really heavy accent swearing doesn't give a crap like this is a knife style sort of personality trait when clearly like it goes so much deeper than that it's just a very like surface level understanding of it. So yeah, it's cool to see like games like this that are kind of they're like attempting to like move the way that we see sort of Australian culture and stories in a direction that can it's still fun and entertaining, which games should be, but also in a way that can be like really serious and heartfelt. And yeah, it's really really cool. Yeah, cool. I guess if anything else you wanted to talk on that topic, or we can move on to something else.
I think I'm all good.
All good? Cool.
Happy to move
Well,
on.
we've got a couple of like questions here that, oh, not questions, but just basically like things that, to help sort of discuss our game and, keep it on the Australian theme and stuff. So, what do you think is the most Aussie or Australian thing about your game? We'll start with you, Maddie.
Oh, so I opened up Blender and I modeled an AFL football.
Oh, really? Cool.
I I had to like Google what the dimensions of it were, but so in my game, if you look on the Steam page, you can see a screenshot of this. I've got this really Aussie pub,
Yep.
and I just wanted to make this pub scream like this could be any pub in regional Victoria. And some feedback I got from some friends was we needed sports memorabilia on the wall. So yeah, chucked some
resonates.
cricket bats and an AFL ball up there.
Yeah, very good. Predictions on who's going to win the final on Saturday?
I don't want to be recorded.
Yeah, fair enough. I'll happily back the Swans because they're the team that I support, so that's fine. But yeah, cool. Alan, what about you? Most Aussie thing about your game?
Well, I think there's many things. I think well, in particular with Wayward Strand at the moment, I think the most Aussie thing, other than being set in Australia, is just kind of the people and their own individual stories. I know that's kind of like a cop-out answer, but it's kind of like just things like little references to locations where people grew up or little stories connected to I know certain elements in their past, and like that you can really kind of pick up the tiny little nuances of Australian culture through conversation, which is really really good. And then before that, I guess working on Miska, which is it's basically an Australian national park, a fictional one, but the most Australian thing would be the animals and connecting with what you've got your wombats, you've got other certain animals that you could find and the environment and learning about that. So that's yeah, very very Australian, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, very cool. I haven't actually had a chance to play Wayward Strand yet, but is that actually a defined location in Australia where that airship is? Or is it meant to be a bit more sort of your own interpretation of where it might be, sort of thing?
There probably is, and I feel like I should know the answer to that. But
Yeah.
at least to me, it is kind of like the location itself is. It could be the airship. I think could be in any rural town in Australia.
Okay, yeah. So it could work. It could
yeah.
work anywhere. Yeah, because I know obviously you got some like really superstar Australian voice actors.
Oh, definitely.
Working on that game as well. It's been
Yeah.
incredible. So, yeah, yeah, that's very cool. It's Sorry, you go.
Oh,
Apologies.
I just had a question
Yeah.
about something Alan said. You said like, oh, incorporating all these like little mannerisms and nuances into the character dialogues. Do you have an example of one that you feel like is like particularly Australian?
Oh, I think it's a lot of the slang that comes in is like really. I can't like say anything right now because I will butcher it. But but like, there's just a lot of different slang that you'd hear here that is kind of like that is so fun, and I wish I could incorporate that into my everyday conversation, but it just does not come out the same when I say it. But yeah, I think like slang and just that's kind of like the biggest one for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very cool. Funnily enough, I find myself again, I guess as the Aussie-born person in the group with like the person that's probably got the least Aussie stuff in their game. But obviously, I guess the most Aussie thing in my game would be Brunt herself, which is obviously our main character, which is a wombat. But in order to like not sort of spoil any elements of the story and stuff like that, we've had some comments on Twitter for people who've seen it. They've been like, like obviously it's a wombat and stuff, but like the fauna and the foliage and stuff that we see in your game, it doesn't really strike us as like Australian, like in terms of location. Like there's not like gum trees or anything like that, which is an incredibly deliberate decision on our part. But yeah, I think again, like the Aussie part of our game is coming through in the way that we're trying to tell almost a little bit of a fish out of water story about an Australian character that has like those kind of roots, but isn't necessarily in their home right now. And it results in a character that like feels really, really alien in the location that she is, and that's a big driving part of the story and stuff like that. Which I think can be like quite effective as a storytelling element, but it does kind of pull us away from the really deep elements of like it being an Australian game. Like I've noticed that people have been making the comments that like obviously because it's a wombat, which is a native Australian animal, that this is like a really Australia inspired game, which at least in this instance it kind of isn't, which I find really, really interesting. I kind of wonder if like maybe an international team had worked on this game, whether it would be assumed that it's an Australian game if it wasn't made by Aussie developers. Yeah, so kind of interesting in that regard. So
It's really interesting that you say that, because now I want to take a look at it, and I'm sure Alan does too, because I feel like it actually probably is very Australian just because it was made by Australians.
And we just don't even realize that we've like done that, right? Like it's just naturally, we've just put our own like sort of artistic flair into it and stuff.
Yeah,
like
definitely.
That.
Yeah, I bet it's got Aussie fingerprints all over it.
And we just don't
For
even
sure.
realize. I think that might be the case for sure. We were looking and we're like, at least in terms of like location, the most closest it could potentially be would be like the rainforests up in like northern Queensland and stuff like that. But otherwise it doesn't really look like Australia.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think you're right, at least in the way that like our writing works and kind of our very like sort of blunt humor and stuff like that. I think that might have shined through in ways that we weren't even necessarily aware of. So yeah.
I think
super
like,
interesting observations.
I find it really interesting you describing your character in that way, because I connected to your character just then, and maybe Maddie, you feel the same way, because that's how us as internationals feel coming to Australia at the same time of like everything else is foreign. So I think it's really interesting because your character, who is very Australian, and myself, who's very international, we still like connect and resonate in that sense.
Yeah, which I guess is really cool in a way, right? Like, I think everyone in some way, irrelevant of where they are, can connect to that feeling, the feeling of like the unfamiliar, or maybe being in a place that they're like not completely familiar with. But the fact that it can connect with you in that way, in a way that like, we didn't necessarily intend, is really awesome. I think that's the thing I love about game development in general, is the way that you can connect with players in ways that you don't even predict is going to happen.
Yeah, for sure.
Which
I
is
also
super, super cool.
just want to like really quickly commend you in what you said, something you said earlier of like combat wombat. That is like mwah, ace wording right there.
Yeah. No, it's cool. Yeah, we definitely use it as a as like a descriptive term. We've had a few people suggest that like, oh, you should change the name to that. Again, for law reasons, probably not something we can do. And then also, from like a legal standpoint, we know that there's lots of things out there that actually use the term combat wombat, so we don't even know if we'd be able to do that comfortably. But in terms of like just a marketing way of describing her, we think it works really well because after all, she's a wombat and she does combat. So
I have a super
very cool.
serious wombat question to ask you.
Yeah, of course.
Does your wombat have any like wombat specific moves she can do? Like I've heard wombats sometimes crush their opponents with their bums.
Yep, so that was one of the first moves that we actually implemented into the game, which internally is still just called the butt slam. I don't know if we'll call it something else at the time, but yeah, it's basically we were like, took the idea of like, you do your classic air attacks and stuff like that. But we were like, we want like the 3D equivalent of like Super Mario coming in and jumping on a Goomba's head, but like a meteorite. So as long as she's high enough, no matter what height you do a jump at, she'll just do this colossal slam into the ground to try and squish enemies. And we've got like cool little features within it, which is like if you fall let's say like 2 meters height in game engine, right? If you fall that, she'll land and then be able to bounce up rather quickly. But if you jump from too high and then you land, she'll kind of just starfish onto the ground and be a bit slower to get up because obviously it's just been this like massive like force that's crashed into the ground. Which is really funny. So we've tried to adopt, we're a small indie team, so we can't do like everything, but we've tried to adopt kind of clever mechanics and systems with our character because she is specifically a wombat. So if you go watch our trailer, she's got a burrowing ability where she basically burrows underground and you can move around in like soft dirts and terrains and stuff like that. And every mechanic we build at Toybox, we build with the intention of being able to be used in multiple situations. So you can burrow underground, which is cool. So not only does that act as a way to maneuver, we can set up traversal and puzzles using that. So maybe you can only get to a certain location by burrowing under like some collapsed logs or something like that. We quite often have systems where you need to burrow under something to collect, say, a weighted object. You then need to throw that object back over a wall in order to put it where it needs to be, and then you need to burrow back under to get that. She also can do like a sort of like an attack uppercut out of the ground if she's below enemies. And it also acts as a way to like she like carries rocks and stuff around in her purse that she can use to like throw at enemies and throw at particular objects within the environment and stuff. And yeah, those get replenished only when she burrows underground. So it's basically as she's burrowing, she's like storing rocks in her purse and her pouch and stuff like that in order to be used later. So we tried to build like clever systems around that, which were specifically wombat related, which I think worked pretty well. So yeah.
I'm so excited for this. This sounds
I appreciate
better
it.
than Stray.
Yeah.
Why be a cat when you can be a wombat?
Be a wombat, yeah. It's cool. We went for the approach of like a lot of people have kind of been comparing to the game to like 2018's God of War, which is like such a massive compliment. But it's also a little bit reassuring because we did look at that game a lot for inspiration in terms of like camera placement, attack style, general movement, things like that. So it's really cool that we've been able to kind of put a character like this into a game that's designed to feel very fantastical and epic in its nature.
For anyone watching, it's on Kickstarter. Go.
Yes, it is on Kickstarter. I didn't know if I should be plugging it in this or not, but I appreciate you giving me permission.
It's on Kickstarter. People get on that.
Yeah, I appreciate it so much. Yeah, honestly, it's been there's been so much love for it already, which has been really, really cool. I mean, since we're doing the plugs as well, Wayward Strand just came out a couple of days ago or a week ago now. It's only been very recently though.
Yep.
which is super awesome. And then I can see, so planned release date for 2023 for Call of the Golden Valley as well, Maddie.
It's end of 2023.
End of 2023,
yeah.
But you can wishlist it on Steam right now, so go do that. Support
excited.
us humble little indie devs.
By the time this airs, there will be a demo. Please,
Oh,
please
cool.
give it a look.
Excited.
Very cool. I unfortunately will be starving the people of a demo on Steam, but you will be able to play it at PAX Australia if you're there. So
Nice.
that's very
I'll
exciting.
be there. I'll come find you.
Yeah, cool. Please do. That'll be awesome.
I was gonna ask.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, you go.
Because I liked how you talked about how, Gods of War was an influence for you. Alan, were there any games that you looked to that sort of you're trying to channel when you do your work?
I think for me, I guess this would apply to Miska, since I joined the team for Wayward towards the end, and most of the decision making's been done by that point. But for me, I really like to resonate with games like Journey, or games like Abzu, and kind of atmospheric storytelling.
Yeah.
And that was something that we wanted to bring into Miska when we were developing that. So yeah, I like, for me and everything going forward, I kind of just want to focus on the storytelling aspect. So games like Journey are really kind of like top-notch inspirations for myself. What about you?
I think I would be so happy if I could pull this off. I'm sort of shooting for like Gone Home meets Nancy Drew.
Yes.
Love that. Yeah, that's so good.
I think that's really the vibe, and what you were talking about, because it's interesting that you picked Journey as a storytelling example, because if I'm remembering right, it doesn't have any words.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
And that's something that I've been thinking about a lot, is sort of how does your environment and the interaction with your environment tell a story? And I think that's why I felt like Gone Home did a really good job of that. Like, the house is really the story, and there's a little dialogue here and there, but that's not really like that's only a small component of it.
Yeah.
Very cool. I've just realised that I've got a bunch of cockatoos out my windows screeching and squawking that are definitely going to come through my mic. So if that doesn't make this an Aussie panel, I don't know what does. Yeah, cool. Yeah, awesome. So what do we got here? I'm just having a quick look through some of the things that we wrote down and stuff like that. I love this. I love this question at the bottom. Was like, should all games coming from Australia reference a sausage sizzle, or at least once on the platform something around like, what is it? How do you use your platform to get everyone in the world called McDonald's Maccas and stuff like that? I think in a way though, like, even though that's kind of a joke question reference, but it's also sort of like, we do have some really like interesting, like, mannerisms and kind of just things that people know about. And while I guess for like Hollow Hero, this isn't something that's like a distinctly Australian thing, a lot of people have picked up on the fact that obviously wombats poop cubes. And everyone's like really like on top of that and stuff like that. And of course, like you were talking about like the sort of like the slang and stuff in Wayward Strand, or for example in Call of the Golden Circle, Maddie, like we were looking at your pub, and even for me, like the second I looked at it, I'm like, I swear to God, I've literally like walked through this RSL, right? Like, is there particular things that I guess either of you, when doing this stuff, like, are there things that you really want to put into your game that you're like, I'm deliberately trying to make this particular thing to be a really obvious reference to Australia? Or is it something that's like a bit more subtle? Like, do you kind of just think about it and go with it? Or is it something that is a bit more like planned about the way that you want the potential players to perceive it, you know what I mean? So, for example, you know, Maccas, I remember using that term repeatedly when I was in the States, and every single US citizen looked at me like I was crazy, just because it's so ingrained into the way that I speak. But then something, you know, a bit more, you know, in terms of like our slang and stuff, is a bit more of an internationally understood and known sort of thing. So are these things that you kind of think about when making a game, or is it more your games, or is it more just a spur of the moment sort of thing?
The thing that screams to mind is Aussie nicknames. So when I first
Shazza?
yeah, when I first met my partner's friends in Australia, they were like, "Can we call you Mazza?" And I had no context, and I was just sort of like, no, thank you.
Yeah, pass, thanks.
And, I didn't really like, especially the Daza. And you know, one time I met a fellow named Gaz, and I finally asked him. I was like, "What is Gaz Australian for? Like, what is your real name?" And I want to put that in my game because the protagonist in the game actually is an American who's through a series of misadventures sort of found themselves in this small town. And I want the NPCs to be like, "Oh yeah, go ask like Daza about it." And then you're, as a player, you're just like, "Who the F is Daza?"
Yeah.
Like, who might that be? And I think like then, you know, when the dialogue panel comes up, you can do like Daza ? When the person's talking. And I think there's just some fun that, you know, we can have with that.
I love that. I've just noticed in like some of your screenshots that there's clearly like a barkeeper called Darren, who I assume is meant to be Daza, right? So
Spoilers,
cool.
much.
Oh, I'm sorry, but like that, I think that perfectly encapsulates the very thing that you're actually talking about, right? Yeah, very, very cool. Very, very cool. Alan, what about you?
I think for me, it kind of depends on the situation. And because I think we touched on this lightly before, that I think it depends on your perspective as well, because working on like Miska, which is directly connected to the animals and national parks, I feel like internationally you would look at that and be like, this is so crazily Australian. But then when you're actually here, that's just kind of your everyday life, if you are in national parks, that is. So you don't necessarily recognize it as like, this is super, super Australiana, because that's just part of your life, right? But then I think on the flip side of that as well, you can have games a little bit like some elements of Wayward, and even perhaps within Hollow Hero as well, is that like it might not necessarily feel Australian, but because we are in the context of Australia ourselves, and maybe other players who are from Australia or other Australian devs will look at it and be like, just feel that connection to Australia as well, if that makes sense. In the past, I've worked on a game called Video World by Things for Humans. And that in itself, I don't think there's like major references to Australia in particular, but it was an Australian developer and an Australian team, and for me, I resonate with it, and I feel like it's very Australian, even though contextually it might not be. So I think it just really comes from your perspective, with how you approach things.
Yeah, cool. Very cool. It's interesting. I guess like bouncing off of that, just again looking through this list of topics that I have to talk about. Like, I guess you know, advantageously, you know, both of you coming from a like an international perspective and now living within Australia. Like one of the things we've said here is like, you know, do you have to be Australian to showcase Australian cultures in games? Which I guess we've already got the answer to that, which is obviously no. But like, what values do you bring from your own experiences before coming to Australia that you think help make an Australian game more Australian, I guess is the way I'm kind of thinking about it. So like Maddie, you said, the idea your game's main character is an American that's ended up in a rural town. That's a super fascinating concept, right? And then, likewise, Alan, you were saying that obviously, you've what was it, UK and Thai, was it?
Yes.
Yeah, but then you grew up in Indonesia?
Yeah.
Yeah, and now you're in Australia, right? So it's like, it's all of these, like, you've got all of this, like, cultural influence and stuff like that. Do you feel like you have an opportunity to really inject those kind of experiences into an Australian game while obviously bringing that kind of, experience but still keeping it a very Aussie game?
Yeah. I would say I think so, because what I'm about to say probably could apply for like any country technically, but I think that regardless of where you are in the world, it is kind of a melting pot of cultures and a melting pot of like different heritages, different ancestry. Absolutely. And at least here in Melbourne, it is so multicultural that even though people might have heritage from international countries, everything that they do is still very Australian. Like going to Chinatown in the middle of the city still feels pretty Australian in a weird way. I don't know if that makes any sense, but it's just kind of, I think that it doesn't necessarily matter if you're from far away or not from Australia, but it's just how you resonate with it. And if you can express that in what you're doing, then it's like all good.
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool. I think I completely agree with you. What about you, Maddie?
I think what I've really liked about Australia and has really stood out to me is like they've almost got these like core values as a country, right? Like everyone gets a fair go and mateship, and probably more that I'm not aware of because I didn't go to primary school here.
Yeah.
But I really like how those are very like kind values, but two, I like how they're not tied to where you're from or what you look like or what you sound like, right? Those are pretty universal things. So I think, like Alan was saying, you can have these things that maybe superficially on the surface wouldn't seem so Australian, but then they actually fit perfectly within that umbrella. So I think it's a very sort of, I know at times to some people it can be an exclusionary culture, but I think overall, and maybe particularly comparing to the US, I've been finding it pretty kind.
Yeah, okay. Cool. Very cool. I have to admit, my own experiences in the US, it was so interesting being an Aussie over there, just because they knew I was an Aussie.
We
like,
I love Australians.
I love Australians. Yeah,
I cannot understate this.
Yeah, and it was cool because I've always felt like I don't know how well it comes through in a mic, but the more excited I get about something, the more loud I can kind of be. And I know it's a bit of a stereotype that like, Americans are loud and stuff like that, but I really did feel amongst my people when I was at GDC, I was just able to be as loud as I liked, and everyone just like matched my tone. It was great. Yeah, cool. We're running out of time, so I think I just want to touch on just one last thing quickly. Just because, it's really important that like we're talking about Australian games and Australiana games, and we've been talking about it from our perspectives, but we haven't really touched on Indigenous and Aboriginal representation in games. Now, full disclosure, the three of us had a little bit of a discussion beforehand about how we were going to approach this because none of us are Indigenous Australians. And yeah, so we wanted to obviously be like super respectful, and we don't want to do anything that could basically come off as disrespectful. So we basically wanted to be really careful about making any kind of assumptions. For me personally, I just wanted to say that it is something that I think is really, really important. The more that I'm introduced to kind of the issues with the lack of Indigenous representation within games, the more I realised just how little I was taught during school. I know plenty of people in my own friends groups and stuff that haven't even heard of things like NAIDOC Week. So it kind of just really shows how like while there's this very interesting element to what Australian culture is, which is what we've been talking about today, and the way it's been perceived, and like just the kind of the culture that exists there. There's this really compelling, important, fascinating, and just beautiful culture and history that exists below the surface when we're talking about Indigenous Australian culture that I genuinely hope becomes more and more prolific and more part of the mainstream in a way that remains respectful to Indigenous people and elders and their lands and stuff like that. Our character Brunt is a character that we have designed in such a way that, as of right now, she doesn't actively portray any Indigenous heritage, but we've designed her in such a way that so that when we have the resources as we progress through the game, we're hoping we could introduce how that could be part of where she has come from. That's been a decision we've made because there's no Indigenous people in our team, because we want to be able to speak to elders and make those correct calls and stuff like that. I think the potential for the kind of the dream times and the stories that I have heard from Indigenous Australians and stuff, I think have the potential to have really, really interesting and compelling effect on an international level if it's done correctly. But it's just about getting to that path. So I just thought it was important to bring up the fact that it is absolutely something that we want to cover, but we thought it would be best to not necessarily go down that path without, actually having people here to represent that correctly. I wasn't sure if either of you wanted to chime in on that or not, but I just thought it was important to bring up just before we finished up today. So,
yeah, I think I would just kind of add that working on Wayward, we do have an Indigenous character. The name's Ted, and it's been such a great experience, like learning about the character and learning about some stories as well. It's just kind of, if you are a developer in Australia and you want to go down these routes, have conversations and have discussions and meetings with elders and, make sure everything's done respectfully and honestly. And that's kind of just the best kind of approach you can go forward.
Yeah. I'm at the
100%.
same place as you are, Tyson, because it's one of those things where you don't want to sweep it under the rug, but also it's not your story to tell. So I think right now where I'm at is sort of the like I need more resources because you want to do it right. But I think it's also so important just to be able to talk about it and say, we don't actually have a great answer to this right now, but we're thinking about it.
100%. I think honesty and transparency and always is always the path forward. And I think even just through this, admitting that, more that needs to be done, and wherever we can, uplifting those kind of stories and people is the best way to go. And hearing that, you've got a character like that in Wayward Strand is like super, super awesome. And I know that there's some really, really awesome games that are being made right now by teams that have Indigenous developers within them, and they're focused around Indigenous storytelling or sort of like, interesting new takes on that storytelling that's really, really solid. So it's good to see. It's really, really good to see. And with that, we're pretty much at the end of our time. So if either of you had anything, unless either of you had anything else you kind of wanted to go over, I think we can pretty much wrap that up in a nice little bow.
I'm good with the bow.
Yeah, good with the bow?
Yeah,
you good as well, Alan?
I'm blanking now, yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah, cool. All right, well, yeah, Alan, Maddie, thank you so much for joining me. I kind of hijacked it and just kind of MC'd this myself. I apologise, but I think it's worked out.
It was perfect.
No, thank you.
Yeah, and either way, anyone who watches this, we hope you thoroughly enjoyed having a listen. Again, like our particular Steam pages will be attached to this. I know I'll be at Games Week. Alan, did you say you were going to be at Games Week as well?
Yes, I will be, yeah.
Yeah, and what about you, Maddie?
I'll be there.
Yeah, cool. Well, we're all going to be there, so you'll, have seen our faces now because of this talk. So if you happen to be there, you want to come say hi to us, please do. With that, we'll finish up. Cheers.
Thanks.
Thanks.